Chapter 9 Bitter Medicine. Xu Yang had always envisioned his death would be a magnificent blaze of violence, red-hot slashes of sharp iron, a carnage of blood and bone, dragging a dozen enemies down with him to hell. But when the careening cart bore down on him, he was just something small, curled up, frozen, 7 years old again. There was a hard impact, darkness, a merciful end to the cruelty of existing at last. The very last thing he knew was the echo of his own whimpered scream. There was such a familiarity to the scene when he slowly came to again that his sluggish thoughts wandered in confusion. If he had somehow gone back in time, been given that desperate chance to start all over that sometimes haunted his unguarded dreams. Pain, but drugged dull and distant, and a presence beside him he would have killed for, died for, lived for. Smooth, slender fingers tangled with his own. Xiao Xingzhen. You're awake? The fingers withdrew, and he could have screamed, felt his hand twitch, desperate for them to return. Not, he managed, slurred, lips and tongue uncooperative. You have no proof. Put that hand back. He forced his eyes open with great effort, vision swimming, but he did catch the shadow of a reluctant smile on Xiao Xingzhen's lips before it flitted away. He knew he was alive then, and that Xiao Xingzhen had survived the spell break too. It could have been some blessed afterlife, but if there was one thing he had always known with absolute certainty, it was that they were fate-bound for very different final destinations. Xiao Xingzhen, ethereal, 1 foot already halfway into heaven. Himself, probably to be reborn as something feral with teeth, a dog if he was lucky, if that wasn't aiming too high. Romantically inclined cultivators like to wax poetic of bonds transcending lifetimes. He had always known this brief one would be their one shot. Another reason why it had to be to matter. Unconscious people don't talk, Xiao Xingzhen pointed out, but there was still just a hitch of amusement to his voice. Damn, sleep-talking? There it was again, just a twitch to the lips. He could do this all day, night. He didn't know what time it was, where he was, and nothing could have mattered less. Xiao Xingzhen was here, with him. You came looking for me, Dao Zhang? I had to, Xiao Xingzhen said, simply, and maybe he had been wrong. Maybe this was heaven after all, something long forgotten inside him, going oddly soft. I was the one who asked for your life to be spared. If you had hurt people, killed people, their blood would have been on my hands, along with all the rest. And you would honestly rather be rolled over by the cart a few times again. It would hurt less than whatever the hell the traitorous thing in his chest was doing. Right, yeah, of course. His eyes and throat itched, but dehydration was kind and good and merciful, and there was nothing even close to tears. I didn't, he added bitterly, because apparently this was important to Xiao Xingzhen, and while he could go burned forever for the hurt he was causing, he must also be protected at all costs. Didn't kill anyone. Xiao Xingzhen tilted his head, not entirely convinced, but looking as though he'd like to be. You attacked that farmer's family and threatened them. He scoffed and rolled his eyes. Pathetic, sniveling snitches. Should have killed them for that. For what it's worth, I did ask nicely first. People tend to get jittery if you show up drenched in blood, even if it's just your own. Not everyone is greeted with gifts and smiles like you, Dao Zhang. Some of us get pitchforks. You said you were going to kill them. But I didn't. Mostly because of the amount of sharp implements jabbed his way, but the point still stood. Xiao Xingzhen finally nodded, more appeased. Please don't. No one else. Not ever again. As though he had any right to make demands on him, but ever again sounded a lot like talking about a possible future, and a future with Xiao Xingzhen was what he'd brought him back for, of course, and certainly not anything he had at all doubted he could ever have. Fine, fine, I won't. Xiao Xingjin scowled at the levity, his perfect forehead scrunching minutely in a frown over the blindfold. I want you to promise me. He laughed at that, the absurdity of that. It hurt a lot, but sometimes laughter just had to happen, a little pain be damned. You'd believe me if I did? You would believe my promises. I would want to, said Xiao Xingjin, serious, and the laughing wasn't really worth the pain anymore. He had to draw a few deeper breaths, body so damnably weak. Okay, I promise. Despite asking for the promise in the first place, Xiao Xingjin looked dubious. Hypocrite. He probably should have shown more reluctance, acted as though it would be a hard vow to keep, like he intended on keeping it. No exceptions. He hissed, a sharp little sound. If someone attacks me, I'm not going to stand there and take it without defending myself, Dao Zhang. And if someone attacks you, I'll have them torn to shivering lumps of bleeding meat before they hit the ground. Xiao Xingjin pursed his lips, adorable whenever he had to wrestle with the moral complexities of the real world. No unnecessary killing, he amended, and he would have laughed again at the free reins that offered, if not for his lungs' refusal to draw enough breath, laughed at a promise now so hollowed and malleable he might as well consider keeping it. If it matters so much to you, Dao Zhang, I promise. Xiao Xingjin still looked a bit wary at his tone, as though he had learned some skepticism after all, not quite as blindly trusting as he had once been. A beautiful tarnish on innocence, to be kissed and treasured, like a small perfect bruise, tooth marks on pale skin. He took the chance to twitch his uncooperative hand to the side, brushing those familiar fingers again, but while Xiao Xingjin didn't flinch, he did lift his hand away to rest it primly in his lap instead. If you're only going to let me touch you while I'm actively dying, we're going to have some very interesting times coming up, he bit out, angrier than intended, but at least he didn't sound hurt. Xiao Xingjin scowled. You promised you wouldn't hurt anyone. That includes yourself. He laughed, kept biting to keep the complexities of Xiao Xingjin's voice at a safe distance. I said I wouldn't kill anyone, Dao Zhang. I never said anything about not hurting people. You can't take away all my fun. Xu Yang. You really are disgusting, his memories unhelpfully filled in from the last time Xiao Xingjin had said his name quite like that. All his laughter was instantly quenched. Don't, he hisses, despite himself. Xiao Xingjin looked confused. Don't say that. Say what? Xu Yang, he imitated, with Xiao Xingjin's inflection, turning the words into an accusation. If anything, it made Xiao Xingjin look more confused, frowning. It is your name. On your lips it sounds like a curse. Xiao Xingjin remained silent, cruelly, wouldn't contradict it, because, of course, the bright moon would never lie. Xu Yang was beginning to regret waking up. It would all probably have remained a much sweeter scene without him in it. Clasping his hands in his lap, Xiao Xingjin turned his head down, as if he could actually see them, fingers uncharacteristically restless. I didn't know, he finally said, after the silence had remained uncomfortable for far too long, cautiously placing the words of his thoughts into a sentence, one by one, like cups and kettles arranged for a tea ceremony with greatest care. I didn't know how badly hurt you were, and I should have asked. I'm sorry for that. He blinked, then just stared at him, their calm, composed face, the blindfold a glowing gush of white in the dim light. What? The doctors told me about the extent of your injuries. I hadn't realized. Sometimes being blind, it allows a way out, not having to know or think about certain things. I took that way out, and it was cowardly. Every single one of those words would certainly be worth its weight in gold as a weapon turned right back against him, but Xu Yang was still reeling too much to even think about it, latched onto an odd one out and started laughing again, because it was so absurd. Shao Xingjin, oh, Shao Xingjin, this man could barely even be real. Doctor? You took me to a doctor. Were you that worried about me, Dao Zhang? I found you in a coffin, Shao Xingjin yelled, suddenly on his feet, all attention snapping back to him. And that was a look he hadn't often seen on him, but certainly remembered. Anger, real proper outrage. They said you were dead. He would have liked to stop laughing, he actually would, but there was a bewildered turmoil beneath that he would not ever allow to be seen. He curled his upper lip back instead. A coffin? Sounds awful. Shao Xingjin stepped back, slapped, breathing heavily. Maybe he was just about to cry too. I must have been there for all of a few hours. So upsetting. Tried 2,793 days. He tried to sit up, but every last inch of him was weak and feeble, and he had to give up, sink back down, glaring. Shao Xingjin just stood still, fist clenching and unclenching, breathing still ragged. 2,793 days, yes, that's how long you were gone, lifeless in a coffin. 7, almost 8 years, Shao Xingjin. How dare you try to lecture me? His voice reached a point where it just stopped, throat clenched shut. For a long time the only sound was their raw breathing, a sound almost intimate, indecent. You said you weren't keeping count, Shao Xingjin finally said, slowly, warily sitting down on his chair again. I lied, obviously, he snapped. I do that. You should know that by now. A strange expression bloomed on Shao Xingjin's face, of near childish loss and hurt. I wish you wouldn't. I wish I could trust you, that I could have trusted you. I wish you weren't... Me? He couldn't help but ask, though he didn't really want to bite anymore. Bite harder, not when the man's heart was already scraped bare and bleeding. Shao Xingjin just shook his head in silence, then leaned his face into one trembling hand. Does it have to be this way? He finally asked, and he sounded so tired and hopeless he would have given his remaining hand in a heartbeat to console him. Will it always be this way now? Is this what it always was? What else could it be? He whispered, and he meant it. He would love to hear any options to the contrary. But Shao Xingjin just stayed quiet. Supposedly he didn't know either. You should rest, he said finally, standing slowly as though he was something old and aching, turned to walk away, and he wanted nothing more than to call him back and whine and roll over for but one more touch of those gentle fingers on his hand. He bit his lip hard enough to taste blood, then even harder still, and remained silent, and Shao Xingjin left. Once the brightness of the moon was gone, he eventually slipped back down into fitful sleep, the pain that mattered no longer dull and distant. After some bargaining, they had been given a list of names by the keeper of the coffin house that night, rudely turned away from the first 2 doctors the moment the subject of payment, or lack thereof, was broached. The third name belonged to a cultivator family, willing to lend a hand to strangers in need, and even more so once their names were given. Oddly, Shao Xingjin had realized, in a world so changed, some still remembered the legends of a bright moon and gentle breeze, the distant snow and cold frost. The warm welcome turned less jovial, however, once the half-dead body in need of healing was brought to the examination table. What happened to him? The more soft-spoken of the 2 old women asked, dismayed, as clothes stiff with long-dried blood were peeled away with an unpleasant sound, layer by layer. He was in an accident, Shao Xingjin answered, barely resisting the urge to pace, adrenaline still setting his dantian on fire, only held back by Zijin's calming hand on his arm. He was hit by a cart, they said. This was no accident. the other doctor snapped sharper. This man had been subjected to torture over a course of weeks. That made him stop short, inner fires brutally put out by a bucket of icy water down his spine. What? These cuts and stab wounds are old, a week or two at least, but untended and infected. A fractured jaw, that's newer, and 3 cracked ribs, newer still. The remaining bone of the right shoulder dislocated. Blunt trauma all over. From a few days ago, I'd say, by the color of the bruising. The blood loss is extreme, as well as the resulting dehydration. That he was even alive to get hit by a cart within the last day or two is unbelievable. At least that's just a shallow crack, a mild concussion. I didn't know, he tried to force out, but his voice had lodged somewhere far back in his throat and wouldn't be coaxed to emerge. Somehow, Zijin's touch had gone stiff and uneasy. Qi can only compensate for so much, said the softer woman, and her voice was a bit tight. It's been completely depleted, the meridians are ruptured and collapsing. I don't know if... We'll do what we can, but I can't make any promises. Please, he managed to force out, and thank you. You should leave us room to work, said a sharper voice, suspicion and fair amount of accusation. We have a guest room by the back garden. You can stay there tonight, if you wish. Ali will show you the way. Thank you, he somehow managed again, and let Zijin guide him out of the room, head spinning, nauseous. He hadn't gone close enough to touch Xu, not once since that fateful day in Yi City when he drew his first rebound breath, not once. Had made that conscious choice for a multitude of reasons. Now he wondered if he could have found out sooner, should have found out. Even the parts of him, admittedly many, that hated him with bitter, angry resentment, barked at a word of torture. Zijin must have known, seen, the way he could not, choosing not to say or do anything. Zijin must have caused at least some of that damage. The sun is rising, the sky is pink, you'd love it. Xu had laughed to distract him after the scuffle in the forest, after fighting the snakes, voice oddly thick. Fractured jaw. He was shaking by the time they reached the guest room, guided by a young disciple, bone-weary though the house was small and the walk short. I need to sit down. He was helped to find a seat, a light touch still remaining, hesitant, at his arm. Did you know about this? He couldn't help but ask, though he knew he had no right to judge, no right to interfere with Zijin's hunger for vengeance, already having implored him to show so much more clemency than Xu deserved. A hesitant touch at his hand, and he turned it palm up for an answer. Some, not all. He doesn't show pain. He remembered that, from the time they first met. Not the first, not really, but the time that mattered. Those first weeks in Yi City, when the stranger had gone out of his way to get back on his feet, far too soon, laughing away his concerns. I'm used to hurt, got beaten a lot as a kid, he said, light-hearted. The parts of him not occupied with hatred could have wept. This wasn't what I wanted, he finally said, without meaning to. He didn't know what he wanted, This wasn't what I wanted, he finally said, without meaning to. He didn't know what he'd wanted, what he was possibly hoping for, only that this wasn't it. You need rest, Zijin told him, and his touch was firm. You don't look well. I don't feel well, he almost snapped, but bit it back, only nodded tiredly. Agreed to lie down, though he knew he wouldn't sleep, bloody tears burning his hollowed-out eyes. Why does the world have to be so cruel? He wondered, still, after all this time, taken aback by it. I don't feel well, he almost snapped, but bit it back, only nodded tiredly, agreed to lie down, though he knew he wouldn't sleep, bloody tears burning his hollowed-out eyes. Why does the world have to be so cruel? He wondered, still, after all this time, taken aback by it every single time. How can it be so wondrous and at the How can it be so wondrous and at the same time filled with so much pain? He must have dozed off in the end, because he woke with a start at the knock on the door, the sound of an unfamiliar voice. He must have dozed off in the end, because he woke with a start at the knock on the door, the sound of unfamiliar voices. We have done what we can, said the softer spoken of the two doctors. The rest is up to him, but if he's been We have done what we can, said the softer spoken of the two doctors. The rest is up to him, but if he's been stubborn enough to make it this far, I think he might just live. Xu Yang asleep in a sickbed looked much the same as Xu Yang in a coffin, peeled down to something almost human. Not an error of judgment he was going to make, Songlan thought viciously. A serpent at rest still had venom and fangs. Clearly so, going by Xingjin's state of distress after returning from the sick room earlier, saying that Xu Yang had woken up but not wanting to say much more. The man's breathing was shallow and a bit too fast, loose hair sticking to clammy skin, throat as always looking so very crushable. At this point, couldn't death almost be considered mercy? He stood silent and stared at his enemy for a long time. He had promised to stand guard for a while, as Xingjin got some well-needed rest. Then Xu Yang made a small noise, twitched, and started violently awake at the sight of him, a moment of fearful feral apprehension in his eyes before the mask slipped back on. He bared his fangs in a grimace, only distantly related to smiling. Song Daozhang, and here I had almost managed to forget you still existed. He dignified him only with the briefest of cool looks. This time, however, he had come prepared. Ink, brush, and paper. A voice. He gave me his blessing, he carefully wrote, angling the paper so the words could be read by them both. In the forest, to take your life as I saw fit. Something flashed through those dark eyes, gone immediately, but he had looked for it. Disbelief, betrayal, hurt. That's why you're here? To kill me? He just remained silent. He had always known silence could be more impactful than even the loudest screams. He could see it working wonders even now. The noble Songlan Daozhang, about to kill an unarmed man helpless in his bed? So fiendish, so dishonorable, I'm impressed. Tell me, what will it be? You'll rip my beating heart out? Tear my head off? Cut me into 1,000 screaming pieces? How does that even work, I have wondered. In my experience, even the freshest bits of flesh can't scream. He simply waited, patiently. Xu Yang ran out of taunting words eventually, once he realized none of them stuck, just glared at him under low brows, breathing labored. Losing you now would destroy him, he wrote, stroke after calm, decisive stroke. He still misses the friend he believed he had. The look on Xu Yang's face went unreadable, eyes flickering back and forth between the brush and his face. But he knows who you are now, what you are. He won't be tricked again. Still nothing, a very rewarding silence. Voiceless was a far more bearable version of Xu Yang, he concluded. Perhaps he should rip his tongue out before choking the life out of him, when the time came. He would enjoy that immensely. For every moment he spends in your company, seeing you for what you really are, he'll grow to resent you a little bit more, hate you a little bit more. You've already broken him 3 times since your return. A thick swallow, but still no words, just shallow breathing growing more rapid. Xu Yang's eyes seemed transfixed by the ink bleeding out of the brush, calculated strokes meticulously ripping him apart. I can wait until he's ready to let go. A final flourish. At this rate, it wouldn't take long. He calmly placed the finish note on top of Xu Yang's heaving chest, laying the brush back on its tray. Spell broken, the man snarled, chin jutting out to bare all his teeth at him. His four-fingered hand came up and spasmodically crumpled the paper, then tossed it contemptuously to the floor, like trash. As though it mattered, as though the words hadn't already been shot and seen to hit home. "Get out!" Xu Yang hissed, not even bothering with threats they both knew he couldn't carry through. Just spat at him with sheer poison, undiluted hate. He remained standing, calm, cool, aloof, just long enough to drive home the point that, should he choose to, he would stay as long as he wanted. Not a thing Xu Yang could do about it, except hiss and swear and suffer his presence. But he had said what he had come to say, and honestly, there were few places he was less inclined to remain than in any small space shared with Xu Yang. Not bothering with any second glances, he turned on his heel and left. Blooper. Get out! 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 Get out!